From the outside, the villages of northern Uganda once followed familiar rhythms. Children walked to school at dawn. Families gathered at night. Life moved forward, quietly, predictably, and without expectation of danger. Then children began to vanish. At first it happened in ones and twos. A child failed to return home after sunset. A bed was found empty in the morning. Parents assumed confusion, or coincidence, or misunderstanding. But over time, a pattern emerged, and that pattern would force investigators, psychologists, and international observers to confront one of the most disturbing systems of coercion in modern history. This story is not about violence for its own sake. It is about how belief, fear, and isolation can be weaponized. It is about what happens when children become targets in a conflict they cannot understand or escape. This case would later teach experts about extremist indoctrination, cult psychology, and the long-term impact of trauma on developing minds. Northern Uganda in the late 1980s and 1990s was shaped by instability. Decades of political upheaval had weakened trust in institutions. Communities were rural, spread out, and often cut off from rapid communication. For families living there, survival depended on routine and faith. Children were at the center of that life. They attended boarding schools, they helped with farming. They walked long distances each day, often before sunrise. From a psychological perspective, these routines mattered. Predictability creates safety, and when that predictability is shattered, fear spreads quickly. The group responsible for those disappearances did not present itself as a criminal organization. It presented itself as a spiritual movement. That distinction is critical to understanding what happened next. The organization claimed a divine mission. It promised moral renewal. It spoke in the language of faith, prophecy, and destiny. For families in deeply religious communities, those claims created confusion rather than immediate resistance. People did not understand what they were facing, and by the time they did, it was already too late for thousands of children. Experts later identified this as a classic tactic of coercive groups. They exploit existing belief systems. They blur the line between obedience and survival. They reframe violence as purpose. Children were not recruited through persuasion. They were taken through fear. Most abductions happened at night. Boarding schools were targeted because children slept far from their families. Armed individuals would enter dormitories while students were resting. The message was simple and absolute: come with us or face immediate consequences. From a developmental psychology standpoint, this matters deeply. Children lack the cognitive tools to evaluate threats rationally. When placed in extreme fear, compliance becomes automatic. Once taken, separation began immediately. Children were cut off from familiar faces. They were moved across borders. They were denied sleep, food, and reassurance. This process is known as identity erasure. It is a documented method used in cults, extremist groups, and abusive systems. The goal is not obedience alone. The goal is dependence. The group's leadership reinforced this dependence through religious framing. Commands were delivered as divine instruction. Disobedience was described as spiritual failure. Children were taught that survival depended on faith. They were told protection came from rituals, not escape. Punishment was framed as correction. Forensic psychologists studying similar cases explain this as moral inversion. Right and wrong are redefined. Harm becomes duty. Fear becomes loyalty. Girls faced an additional layer of exploitation. Their roles were assigned based on perceived obedience and appearance. This was not random. It was systematic. Experts emphasize that such systems rely on total control of the body and mind. Choice is removed. Agency disappears. What remains is survival behavior. One of the most disturbing elements of this case is how children were forced to participate in sustaining the system. They were ordered to bring in other children. They were sent back into the same communities they came from. This is a known tactic in coercive organizations. It creates psychological entrapment. Leaving becomes unthinkable when returning means facing those you harmed under duress. From the outside, observers often ask a painful question: why did nobody stop this sooner? The answer lies in geography, politics, and visibility. The affected regions were remote. Borders were porous. International attention was limited. More importantly, the suffering was gradual. There was no single moment that demanded immediate global response. Instead, there was a slow accumulation of loss. Investigators later noted how the group adapted continuously. When pressure increased in one area, it shifted to another. When visibility rose, it retreated deeper into isolated regions. This adaptability is a hallmark of extremist organizations built on ideology rather than territory. They do not require public support. They require fear. At the center of this system was a leader who positioned himself as a prophet. He claimed divine authority. He framed commands as revelations. Psychologists caution against focusing too heavily on individual charisma. The real power lies in structure. Belief systems that remove accountability create space for abuse. This case would later become a foundational example in studies of religious extremism. It demonstrated how spiritual language can be repurposed as control. It showed how children, when isolated and threatened, can be conditioned to comply. But in the early years, none of this was clear. Families searched without answers. Communities lived in constant fear of nightfall. Children began sleeping outdoors in groups, hoping safety came in numbers. They walked miles each evening to avoid being alone. These were known as night commuters. That detail would later become a key indicator of how widespread the crisis had become. When children alter their lives to avoid being taken, the system has already failed them. From an educational standpoint, this chapter matters because it shows the beginning, not the most visible moments, the quiet ones. This is where the story truly starts. Before investigations, before international warrants, before campaigns and headlines, it starts with children who trusted the world around them, and a system that learned how to break that trust completely. What nobody understood at the time was how long this would last, or how difficult it would be to undo. And this is where everything begins to change. The first reports reached local authorities quietly. A missing child here, another one there. At first they were treated as isolated incidents, but patterns do not stay hidden forever. By the early 1990s, it was clear something coordinated was happening. Entire dormitories were being emptied overnight. Children were vanishing in groups, not alone. Investigators began reconstructing timelines. They relied on witness accounts. They listened to children who escaped and found their way home. Most described the same sequence: armed figures arriving after dark, voices whispering commands, a single choice presented as survival. From a trauma analysis perspective, these moments are critical. Memory formed under fear is fragmented, details blur, but emotional impressions remain sharp. Children remembered the silence. They remembered being told not to look back. They remembered walking for hours, sometimes days. The movement itself was deliberate. Children were forced to travel long distances on foot. This exhausted them physically and mentally. Exhaustion is not accidental in coercive systems. It lowers resistance. It increases suggestibility. Those who could not keep up were used as examples. Punishment was public. It reinforced obedience without explanation. Importantly, descriptions of harm were often indirect. Children spoke about consequences, not actions. This is consistent with protective memory responses in minors. Once inside camps, the process accelerated. Names were stripped away. New roles were assigned. From a psychological standpoint, this is identity reconstruction. The child's past is framed as irrelevant. The group becomes the only source of meaning. Commanders used religious language constantly. Orders were delivered as spiritual obligation. Disobedience was described as betrayal of faith. Experts later noted how this blurred moral boundaries. Children were no longer choosing between right and wrong. They were choosing between obedience and punishment. This is where the incident becomes more than a crime. It becomes a system. Children were not only controlled, they were turned into instruments of expansion. They were sent back into villages. They were ordered to locate others. They were told escape was impossible. This tactic serves two purposes. It spreads fear outward, and it locks the child inward. Psychologists refer to this as coerced complicity. Once a child believes they have caused harm, returning home feels impossible. Shame becomes a prison. Communities responded in ways that reveal the scale of the crisis. Families organized patrols. Schools tried relocating students, but resources were limited. Communication was slow, and borders offered no protection. The group moved freely between Uganda, South Sudan, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Jurisdiction became unclear, responsibility blurred. This is a known vulnerability in regional conflicts. Extremist groups exploit gaps between governments. They survive where coordination fails. By the late 1990s, international observers began documenting the situation. Human rights organizations gathered testimonies. Patterns were confirmed. Estimates suggested tens of thousands of children had been taken. The majority of the group's members were minors. This was no longer incidental. It was foundational. From an investigative perspective, this presented a unique challenge. Traditional criminal models did not apply. There was no single crime scene. Instead, there was a moving network of harm, one that left little physical evidence, one that relied on fear rather than force alone. The leader remained distant. Messages filtered downward through layers of command. Responsibility was intentionally obscured. This structure is common in extremist movements. It protects leadership. It disperses blame. As pressure increased, the group adapted again. Camps became smaller. Movements became less predictable. The incident was no longer a single event. It was a prolonged state of crisis. For children inside the system, time lost meaning. Days blurred together. Survival replaced planning. For families outside, hope and fear existed side by side. Every rumor brought possibility. Every silence brought dread. Investigators later reflected on this period as the most difficult. There were no breakthroughs, only confirmation of scale. But what they did not know yet was that evidence was accumulating. Slowly, quietly, testimonies were aligning, patterns were emerging, and the world was beginning to pay attention. What came next would shift the case from regional tragedy to international pursuit. And it would change how crimes against children in conflict zones were understood forever. As attention increased, investigators began reframing the entire situation. This was no longer viewed as a series of isolated abductions. It was recognized as an organized system of coercion operating across borders. That shift mattered. International legal experts started asking different questions, not just what happened, but how responsibility could be established, and whether this fit the definition of crimes under international law. For the first time, documentation became systematic. Testimonies were recorded carefully, patterns were logged and compared. Former child members who managed to escape became critical sources. Their accounts were handled with extreme care. Trauma specialists were present during interviews. This was not standard police work. It was investigative reconstruction on a massive scale. Psychologists worked alongside legal teams. They helped separate coerced behavior from intent. They explained how indoctrination altered perception and memory. This distinction would later prove essential. Children were not treated as perpetrators. They were recognized as individuals acting under extreme psychological pressure. One of the most important breakthroughs came from consistency. Independent testimonies described the same rituals, the same language, the same rules. From a forensic psychology perspective, this matters deeply. Consistency across unrelated accounts suggests structured training, not coincidence. It points to centralized control. Analysts began mapping command hierarchies, who gave orders, how they traveled, where decisions originated. The picture that emerged was disturbing but clear. Authority flowed downward, fear flowed upward. The leader positioned himself as unreachable. Instructions arrived through intermediaries. Punishments reinforced distance and mystique. Experts describe this as charismatic authoritarianism. The leader is not present often, but belief in their power is constant. This structure made capture difficult. There was no fixed headquarters, no permanent base. As soon as pressure mounted in one region, camps dissolved. Groups scattered into remote terrain. Dense forests became natural shields. Investigators relied heavily on satellite imagery. Movement patterns were tracked over time. Supply routes were identified. This marked a turning point. Technology began closing the gap that geography had protected for years. At the same time, defectors provided crucial insight. They described routines. They explained internal punishments. Importantly, they described fear of supernatural consequences, not legal ones, not military ones. This reinforced a key psychological finding. Belief, not force, was the primary mechanism of control. From an educational standpoint, this case reshaped how experts understood extremist indoctrination. It demonstrated that ideology could override basic survival instincts, especially in developing minds. Legal scholars began preparing cases. Charges were discussed in terms of war crimes and crimes against humanity. This language mattered. It elevated the issue beyond regional politics. It framed the actions as violations of global norms. International cooperation followed. Task forces were formed. Information was shared across borders. But progress was slow. The terrain remained unforgiving. The group remained mobile. There were moments of near capture. There were false leads. There were setbacks. Each failure carried a cost, not just in resources, but in lives affected by continued instability. Public awareness grew unevenly. Some regions paid attention, others did not. Then, years later, a global campaign would bring unprecedented visibility. But visibility alone would not bring resolution. What investigators did not yet know was how fragmented the group had become. Pressure was working, but it was also scattering the problem. The system was weakening, not collapsing, and that distinction would shape everything that followed, because dismantling belief is far more difficult than dismantling an army. And the final chapter of this story would focus not on pursuit alone, but on accountability, on recovery, and on what happens after the world finally looks directly at something it avoided for decades. By the time international warrants were issued, the damage was already irreversible. Entire generations had been affected, communities were changed permanently, legal action focused on leadership, not the children. That distinction was deliberate, and it was necessary. International prosecutors framed the case around responsibility at the top. They relied on documented command structures. They used testimony, satellite data, and expert analysis. The goal was not symbolic justice. It was accountability under international law. From a legal perspective, this case marked a turning point. It reinforced that coercion does not erase responsibility for those who design systems of abuse. Belief does not excuse exploitation. Psychologists contributed heavily at this stage. They explained how indoctrination worked. They clarified why children could not consent, comply, or resist meaningfully. This framing changed how courts and institutions approached similar cases afterward. Children involved in armed groups were increasingly seen through a recovery lens, not a punitive one. As pressure intensified, the organization fractured. Communication broke down. Commanders defected or disappeared. Borders that once enabled movement became barriers. Allies withdrew. Supply lines failed. By the early 2010s, the group's influence had diminished significantly. It no longer controlled territory in the way it once had. Its reach became sporadic. Reports suggested the leader was hiding in remote regions. Others suggested he was no longer alive. Confirmation remained elusive. What mattered more was impact. Thousands of former child members were attempting to rebuild their lives. Reintegration was not simple. Trauma does not disappear when danger ends. It reshapes identity. Mental health professionals emphasized long-term care. Survivors needed stability. They needed education. They needed community acceptance. Some communities struggled with this. Fear and resentment lingered. Understanding took time. This is a common challenge in post-conflict recovery. Healing requires confronting uncomfortable truths, including the reality that children were both harmed and used. Educational programs focused on prevention emerged. They taught warning signs. They addressed how belief systems can be manipulated. From a policy standpoint, this case influenced international child protection standards. It reinforced the need for early intervention and for cross-border cooperation. Public awareness campaigns played a role, but they were imperfect. Visibility brought attention. It did not guarantee resolution. Experts caution against oversimplification. This was not the result of one person alone. It was the result of instability, isolation, and unchecked ideology. The most important lessons come from prevention. Children are vulnerable where systems fail. Extremist groups thrive where oversight disappears. This case teaches us that protection must be proactive, that belief systems can be exploited, and that recovery requires patience measured in years, not months. Today, efforts continue quietly. Support organizations remain active. Former child members continue rebuilding. There is no clean ending to this story, but there is clarity. When children are targeted, the harm extends far beyond the moment of coercion. It reshapes families, communities, and generations. Understanding how this happened is not about the past alone. It is about recognizing warning signs in the present and ensuring they are never ignored again.